The air of the spire always smells faintly of incense and old blood. I remember that smell even now, the mixture of sanctity and slaughter, because it clung to everything the highborn touched. You could step into one of their corridors and feel it in your lungs, a perfumed weight that said someone else suffered for this luxury. From my balcony, I could see the lower hive, a storm of smoke and rust beneath a blackened sky. The manufactorums pulsed with crimson lights like open wounds. Somewhere down there, millions were dying to keep the spire bright. I used to tell myself that wasn't my concern. That survival was its own kind of faith. But even faith has a cost, and in the Imperium, every coin is minted from flesh. They call us the privileged of Terra's image, those born with marble floors beneath their feet, and servitors to breathe the dust for them. The joke, of course, is that the rich never breathe freely. Every breath is counted, measured, traded. A noble's lungs belong as much to the administratum as to his own chest, taxed in air, in food, in quiet obedience. I learned that on the night of my Ascension feast. The chandeliers burned with oil distilled from a world I'd never heard of. A world scoured clean just to fuel our celebration. Choir servitors sang the litanies of prosperity, their faces stretched and wired into eternal smiles. And beneath the music, I could hear the scraping of the chains that fed them air. My father leaned close to me, his voice like the whisper of a blade. Power, my son, is not inherited. It is fed, and what you feed it is what you lose. I didn't understand then. I thought he meant sacrifice in the abstract, the way preachers speak of the emperor's endless suffering. But later, when the feast ended and the guests departed, I saw the real meaning of wealth in the Imperium. Our house maintained its privilege through a tithe known only to the upper spires, the offering of continuance. Every generation a member of our line was chosen for the Officio Medicaeus experiments. The gene tithe ensured our name remained in the records of those untainted by mutation. It was an honor, they said, to keep the bloodline pure in service of humanity's ideal form. But I've seen the ones taken. They don't return. The next morning I watched the shuttles descend into the mist, tiny silver specks gliding toward the laboratories buried in the hive's bones. No one ever asked who was chosen that year. The servants only sealed another wing of the house, draped the banners in solemn gold, and the music played on. That's the first lie of the wealthy in the Imperium, that they are untouched. The truth is, they are simply consumed more slowly. When the Voxcasters spoke of war, we toasted it with Amasec older than the soldiers who'd die for us. When the food shipments faltered, we rationed our luxuries while entire hab blocks starved below. I remember the taste of guilt, metallic, bitter, but we learned early how to swallow it with grace. The servants were taught never to look us in the eyes, not out of fear, but because sight itself was a privilege. They said the gaze of the pure might blind the impure. Yet every time I caught my reflection in their lowered visors, I saw something uglier than mutation. I saw a man who mistook comfort for purpose. There was one servant. Her name was Lyra. She was assigned to maintain the air recyclers in my quarters. Small, quiet, efficient, the kind of worker who fades into the machinery. One night, I found her standing by the window, staring out toward the hive's depths. I should have reported her for breaking protocol. Instead, I asked what she was looking at. She said, "The same stars you pretend to own." I remember laughing, though I didn't know why. She didn't flinch. "Tell me," she continued, "how many lives does it take to keep your sky so clean?" I told her that was the price of order. That the Emperor demanded hierarchy. She looked at me then, really looked, and said, "Maybe he demands honesty instead." That night I couldn't sleep. The vents whispered like the voices of the dead, the hum of the recyclers beating in time with my pulse. For the first time, the luxury of silence felt suffocating. Weeks later, the summons came from the Medici sanctum. A gene tithe was due. My father's expression didn't change when he handed me the data slate. "The Emperor protects," he said, "but even faith has a cost." I watched the shuttles rise again, carrying the chosen ones toward the sanctum's cold light. Lyra was among them. Her name appeared in the ledger beneath a note, "Donor, Level 3 clearance." I tried to intervene, but the decision had already been sanctified by the Adeptus biologists. Once sealed by holy wax, no appeal could break it. She left without looking back. Perhaps she knew I wouldn't follow. That night, the chandeliers burned brighter than ever. The feast resumed, and the noble houses toasted the Emperor's will. I drank, but every swallow felt like betrayal. My father spoke to the guests of legacy, of purity, of eternal service. His words echoed against the marble and into my skull until they sounded like prayers recited by machines. After the guests retired, I descended alone into the lower vaults, a place forbidden even to heirs. There, beneath layers of incense smoke and gilded armor displays, I found the truth of our wealth. Rows of stasis tanks, each holding fragments of human bodies suspended in amniotic light. The bloodline preserved, catalogued, and used. Every name had been a sacrifice, every comfort, a conversion of suffering into power. For the first time, I understood what my father meant. What you feed it is what you lose. And yet, even as I stared at the frozen faces, I felt no rebellion. Only the hollow realization that I, too, would one day be placed among them. Because in the Imperium, wealth is not freedom. It is just a slower form of death. Wrapped in gold leaf and prayer, the vox horns above me sang the hymn of continuance, a melody used to mark noble births and sanctioned deaths alike. Its echo followed me up the stairs, through the empty corridors, and into my chamber, where the incense still burned. I looked out once more across the hive, the endless sprawl of lights beneath the storm. For a moment I imagined I could see the shuttles returning, streaks of silver fading into the dark. But I knew they carried no passengers, only samples, sealed and silent, and somewhere deep below, in a lab lit by sacred fire, the Imperium's rich continued their eternal exchange, trading flesh for legacy, humanity for illusion. I whispered a prayer I didn't believe. "Emperor, forgive us for mistaking sacrifice for salvation," the vox replied with static, perhaps the only honest sound in the spire. The spires hum with prayer. You can hear it in the metal itself, the deep vibration that runs through the walls, as though the entire city were whispering the same name over and over: Emperor. Emperor. It's strange how worship sounds like machinery when you've lived with it long enough. Every servo skull drifting through incense clouds, every cogitator printing the litanies of devotion, every mechadendrite etching holy symbols into steel, all of it part of the same rhythm, the same endless chorus of obedience. Faith in the upper hive is not belief. It's maintenance. You keep it oiled, calibrated, functional. The priests don't speak of miracles here. They speak of systems. Every ritual has a procedure, every prayer a calibration code. Even the candles burn on timer cycles, programmed to extinguish at dawn, relit by servitors with perfect precision. And yet, behind that precision, there's something almost desperate, a hunger to control the divine. The rich pray like engineers. They build their salvation, one repetition at a time, convinced that enough order can force grace to exist. After Lyra was taken, the Sanctum's envoy began visiting our house more often. A man wrapped in crimson and bronze, his face a mask of gilded steel. His voice came through a vox grill tuned to a soothing frequency. He never blinked. He told us that the gene tithe had been most fruitful. He spoke of purity metrics and genomic continuity as though discussing a harvest. My father thanked him as though accepting divine favor. I stood silent. The envoy's gaze turned to me. "You are young," he said. "You should come see how your family's devotion is put to use." I didn't want to. But curiosity is its own form of heresy. Once sparked, it burns. The next day, I followed him into the heart of the hive. We descended in a lift so deep the light began to flicker. The air thickened with oil and ozone. Each level we passed grew darker, narrower, hotter. By the time the doors opened, I could taste metal in my mouth. The sanctum of the biologies was not what I imagined. It wasn't clean or sterile. It was alive, pulsing with cables, wrapped in pipes that breathed steam like living veins. Red-robed adepts moved through the corridors in silence, their limbs half replaced with augmetics, their faces stitched with data ports. The scent of incense couldn't mask the rot of flesh beneath machine oil. The envoy guided me through halls lined with tanks. Inside, shapes floated in pale liquid, some human, others not quite. A child's arm next to a mechanical eye. A lung grown over a lattice of brass. A skull humming faintly with residual charge. "These are the Emperor's gifts," the envoy said. "The continuation of humanity's perfection. Every cell preserved here is a prayer made flesh." He stopped beside one of the tanks. The name etched on the plinth was Lyra. For a moment I couldn't move. Her face was still, peaceful even, suspended in a pale blue light. Tubes ran into her temples and chest, and something mechanical pulsed beneath her skin. She volunteered, the envoy said, as though reading my thoughts. Service is the highest form of faith. I wanted to scream that it wasn't voluntary, that she was chosen because she had no power to refuse, but the words died in my throat. The walls seemed to listen. "Do you understand now," he continued, "why the rich must sacrifice? The lower castes give labor. The faithful give prayer. But those of standing must give lineage, blood and continuity. You pay the Emperor's due not with coin, but with purity itself." He placed his metal hand on the tank's glass. "Your house has served well." The Emperor remembers. I looked at her face. At the faint trace of a scar near her lip, one I remembered from when she'd repaired a broken vent. The machinery inside her chest ticked softly, like a clock counting down eternity. That night I couldn't return home. I walked through the hive's lower tunnels instead, where the light came from leaking coolant and the sound from the endless thrum of pumps. Down there no one prayed aloud. People whispered only when the servo skulls passed, and even then it wasn't reverence, it was fear. A preacher stood on a pile of broken pipes, shouting verses into the dark. His robes were torn, his eyes milky. Around him the crowd murmured. He spoke of judgment, of ascension, of the Emperor's tears. Then he pointed at me. "Look," he cried, "one of them walks among us. See how the blessed tremble when they face the forgotten." The crowd turned. Dozens of faces, thin and hollow, eyes glinting in the dim light. I tried to back away, but the preacher stepped closer. "Tell us, lordling," he hissed, "how many souls keep your fires burning? How many of us must die before your sky stays blue?" I had no answer. A stone struck my shoulder. Another hit my chest plate. Then hands grabbed me, rough, desperate. For a moment I saw hatred raw enough to burn through fear. But before they could strike again, the air split with a shriek of sirens. Skitari patrols emerged from the vents, rifles glowing. The preacher screamed a benediction as the crowd scattered. I fell to the floor, blood in my mouth, my thoughts a storm. The Skitari didn't look at me as they passed. They simply cleansed the area in silence, their augmetic limbs moving like clockwork. One of them paused beside me, a woman, perhaps once human, her face hidden behind glass and cables. She extended a mechanical limb and helped me to my feet. I saw my reflection in her visor, a trembling man smeared with grime. "Next time," her vox said, flat and mechanical, "stay where you belong." When I returned to the spire, my father was waiting. He didn't ask what happened. He only said, "Now you've seen the machinery. Do you understand why it must keep turning?" I told him what I saw, the tanks, the preacher, the faces in the dark. He listened quietly. Then he said something I've never forgotten. "The Imperium survives because everyone believes their suffering is unique. The poor think the rich live without pain. The rich believe their pain has meaning. Both are lies, but lies are what keep the gears moving." He poured me a glass of amasec. "Drink," he said. "It will help you forget." But forgetting is its own form of servitude. I watched the golden lights of the spire flicker against the night and realized something terrifying. Not that the system was monstrous, but that it worked perfectly. The machinery of faith was not meant to redeem anyone. It was meant to keep us synchronized. Every class, every breath, every drop of blood, moving in rhythm with the Emperor's silent will. And in that rhythm, there was no room for doubt. Yet, doubt had already taken root. I began to dream of her, Lyra, suspended in light, her eyes half open, lips forming words I couldn't hear. Every time I woke, the sound of machinery filled the silence like a warning. I knew what it meant. The system doesn't fear rebellion. It fears awakening, because once you see how the machine works, you can never again believe that the prayers are for you. Legacy in the Imperium is a cage gilded with myth. Every noble house claims descent from heroes who served the Emperor during the Great Crusade, but no record can truly prove it. The Administratum's archives are labyrinthine, their ink faded, their parchment eaten by centuries of dust and lies. And yet the claim persists, because without legacy, the rich are nothing but thieves wearing saints' robes. Our house was no different. We had our reliquary, sealed in marble, guarded by a gene-coded lock. Inside, preserved under glass, lay the so-called founding reliquary of Lord Darien Vane, the man who supposedly earned our family its noble charter during the Scouring. The old one spoke of his valor, of the banners he carried into war beside the custodies themselves. I used to believe that story. I used to kneel before that relic and whisper prayers for his guidance. But when I was old enough to access the vault myself, curiosity drove me to open the case. Inside, there was no banner, no armor, just a single femur bone wrapped in tattered cloth and tagged with a number instead of a name. The seal of the Adeptus Mechanicus was burned into the wrapping, a reclamation mark. A reclamation mark meant one thing: the body had been harvested from a mass ossuary. It wasn't a hero's bone, it was a leftover. I stood there for hours, staring at that bone. I think that was the day my faith cracked. Not shattered, but cracked, enough for light to slip through. Still, I told no one, not even my father, because in our world, truth is a weapon that cuts in every direction. To question legacy is to erase your claim to existence. Years passed. I learned to wear the mask of reverence again. I spoke the family prayers, hosted the feasts, oversaw the gene ledgers and the quarterly tithe tallies. Outwardly, I was the perfect heir, composed, devout, dutiful. Inwardly, I was a corpse rehearsing the motions of the living. Then came the summons to attend the Council of Lineage, a gathering of noble houses presided over by the Administratum's High Curator of Records. These councils were part ceremony, part inspection. They reminded the elite that their privilege depended not on wealth, but on service rendered to the bureaucracy of faith. The hall was carved from the bones of a dead Titan. Columns rose like ribs around the gathered nobility. The air was thick with incense and whispers. Each house brought forward its offerings, relics, data slates, gene samples, and oaths of loyalty. The curator, a figure robed in parchment scrolls, his face hidden beneath a mask of ivory script, received them with mechanical grace. When it was our turn, my father presented the record of our bloodline. The curator unrolled it, the parchment cascading down like the unfurling of a banner. His servo quill scratched across it, verifying seals, matching sigils. Then he paused. "There is a gap," he said. His voice was smooth but sharp, like polished glass. My father frowned. "A clerical oversight, surely." The curator tilted his head. 17 generations prior. Missing verification. The seal of continuity is incomplete. That cannot be oversight. A silence spread through the hall. The other nobles leaned forward like vultures scenting weakness. My father's face went pale. "The records were preserved in accordance with the Lex Imperialis," he said. The curator gestured to a robed scribe. The man approached with a data slate and read from it. House Vane, verification lapse following the death of Terra's son, Segmentum Solar Record Archives, Subindex 13. Cause, inconclusive heritage lineage under review. The words struck harder than any blow. Inconclusive heritage, the most damning phrase in the Imperium's social lexicon. It meant impurity. It meant suspicion. It meant extinction, if not corrected. The curator's vox mask hissed. "You have until the next cycle to produce proof of continuity, or your name will be erased from the index of the pure." Erased. That single word felt like the fall of a guillotine. We returned home in silence. My father's hands trembled as he poured himself another glass of amasec. "It's the bone," he whispered. That damned relic. I realized then that he had always known, that our lineage was a fabrication sanctified by repetition and fear. "We can appeal," I said. "Provide other records." He looked at me with eyes hollowed by years of compromise. "There are no other records. There never were. That night I found him in the reliquary again. The glass case lay shattered. The femur was gone. The banners had been torn down. He stood in the corner whispering prayers to an empty wall. "The Emperor knows the truth," he muttered. "The Emperor forgives the faithful, but the Emperor doesn't forgive. The Emperor endures. Forgiveness is a luxury reserved for those who still have a choice." In the days that followed, I saw fear spreading through our household like a contagion. Servitors malfunctioned. Messages arrived sealed in black wax. Invitations to feasts were quietly rescinded. Other nobles began to distance themselves. In the hive, isolation is death, not by sword or poison, but by silence. The Administratum's audit teams arrived. They combed through our archives, comparing genetic records, testing bloodlines, cross-referencing ident marks. I watched them dismantle centuries of pretense in days. Then came the final notice. One descendant must undergo verification by the biologies to confirm continuity. I volunteered, not out of courage, but because my father had already begun to fade. He spent his days staring at the sky, waiting for judgment. When I entered the verification chamber, I was greeted by the same envoy who'd shown me Lyra's tank years before. His smile was the same, too smooth, too practiced. "Legacy," he said, "is a sacred burden. To doubt it is to doubt the Emperor's design." He drew blood, scanned my gene sequence, and compared it to the archival template. Then he frowned. "There is deviation," he said softly. "Minor, but present." "What does that mean?" I asked. He didn't answer. He simply pressed a seal onto a parchment and handed it to me. "Submit this to the curator," he said, "and pray." When I looked down, the parchment read, "Verification pending. Probationary lineage." The words burned like acid. On the lift ride back to the spire, I watched the hive stretch endlessly below, layer upon layer of industry, faith, and decay, and I thought, perhaps this is what legacy truly means. Not inheritance, not purity, but endurance through falsity. Our ancestors didn't climb the spires through virtue. They crawled upward through blood, lies, and survival. And we, their heirs, keep the same climb going, polishing the rust and calling it gold. That night I placed the false relic back into its shattered case. I sealed it with wax, whispered the required prayer, and left the reliquary door open. For the first time, I wanted the dust to enter, to settle over the bone-like truth, finally claiming its place. Because in the Imperium, legacy is not about remembrance, it's about repetition. And repetition is just another name for control. Hunger isn't just the absence of food in the Imperium, it's the absence of meaning. The poor starve in their bodies, and the rich starve in their souls. Both devour whatever lies closest. When the tithes began to falter, the spires above my hive were the first to panic. The flow of imported luxuries slowed. No more off-world fruits, no amasec from the vineyards of Ultramar, no silks blessed by the Sisters of Serenity. The nobility spoke of famine as if it were a rumor, a ghost that haunted the lower decks. But hunger has a way of climbing stairs. At first, it was subtle. Banquets shrank. The orchestras stopped mid-song when the power grids dimmed. Servitors malfunctioned and were quietly scrapped. You could smell desperation in the perfume-soaked corridors, sweet, cloying, and rotten beneath the incense. Then the first food auctions began. The concept was simple. The Administratum would distribute surplus rations from the underhive to the noble houses. The price wasn't in thrones, but in favors, lineage, pledges, and secrets. Each crate of protein paste became a confession booth. I attended one. The auction was held in the Hall of Sustenance, a place that had once been a cathedral. Its statues of saints were draped in gold cloth to hide their crumbling faces. The nobles stood in silence as the first crate was brought forth, stamped with the sigil of the Adeptus Administratum. A clerk in gray robes read the manifest, throne issue nutrient ration, lower grade subhive batch. No one moved. They all knew what subhive batch meant. It meant repurposed biomass. It meant flesh. A noblewoman broke the silence. "I bid one hereditary favor to the office of faith maintenance," she said calmly. Another raised the stakes. 2 tithes of servitors. The bids rose like prayers, elegant and obscene. By the time the crate was claimed, The air felt poisoned with hunger and guilt. I didn't stay to see them open it. In the corridors outside, I met a clerk from the lower decks carrying a data slate marked distribution schedule. I asked him how much of the hive below received their share. He laughed without humor. None, he said. Everything gets rerouted to the spires. The rest is burned to keep the air pure. That night, the Voxcasters announced a new decree, Consumption Purity Protocols. All food distributed to the upper hives would be sanctified by the local ecclesiarchy before consumption. The rich, terrified of impurity, lined up to have their rations blessed. The poor died quietly in the shadows, their bones carted away to the rendering plants. I began keeping count. Each day, I marked the number of shipments received against the number of bodies cremated below. The balance never favored life. My father said it was necessary. The emperor tests his chosen, he said. To endure deprivation is to prove devotion, but there was no devotion in what I saw. Only gluttony dressed in gold. Weeks later, I visited the processing yards on the pretext of inspecting tithe logistics. The stench hit me first, sweet rot and burning protein. Servitors moved along conveyor lines, their mouths whispering litanies as they shoveled remains into grinders. Above them, banners read, "From flesh, faith is renewed." I asked the overseer if the workers knew what they were consuming. He looked at me with dull, sleepless eyes. "They know it's holy," he said. "Now, that's enough." In the distance, I saw children scavenging near the ash piles, their faces pale with soot, their bellies distended. They were too weak to run when the enforcers approached. The whips cracked. The children didn't even cry. They just collapsed one by one into the dust. Something inside me shifted then, not rage, not pity, but clarity. I understood that the Imperium's hunger wasn't accidental. It was ritualized. Every famine was a purge of the unworthy, every shortage a sermon reminding us who was allowed to survive. When I returned to the spire, my father was hosting another feast. The guests toasted survival, their cups filled with synthetic wine. I couldn't eat. Every bite felt stolen. "Smile," my father whispered. "They're watching," so I smiled. I smiled through the speeches, through the music, through the hollow toasts to the Emperor's mercy. Later that night, I stood by the window and looked down again. The hive stretched endlessly, a mechanical throat swallowing its own children, and I realized the truth. Hunger is the Imperium's truest faith. It keeps the poor obedient, the rich afraid, and the machine turning. When the lights flickered and the spire trembled, some said it was just a power surge. Others whispered that the Astronomicon itself was dimming. I didn't know what to believe. But I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever kept this empire alive was feeding on more than flesh. It was feeding on us all. Silence has a sound in the spire. It hums, low and endless, beneath the chanting of priests and the hiss of machines. You hear it most when the music stops, when the last choir servitor powers down, and the only voice left is the thrum of the walls themselves, whispering the one truth no noble ever admits. Everything beautiful in the Imperium is built on something buried alive. It began with the cracks, not in marble, but in morale. The nobles had started to vanish. Entire families would simply ascend for pilgrimage and never return. Their estates were seized by the Administratum, their banners quietly folded, their names erased from public records. The rest of us understood what it meant, but never spoke of it aloud. We all feared the same fate, being swallowed by silence. My father began holding his meetings in private. He forbade the servants from entering the study and covered the windows with velvet cloth. I once overheard him speaking through the Vox link to someone he called the Auditor. Their voice was metallic, calm, almost reverent. "Your tithe obligations exceed your current resource allotment," the auditor said. "We are loyal," my father replied. "We serve as we always have." "There is a discrepancy in your sacrifices," the voice answered. "Correction is required." The transmission ended in static. That night he summoned me. "You must prepare," he said quietly. "The house requires another offering." I thought of Lyra, of the tanks, of the hum of machinery beneath the sanctum. I asked who was chosen this time. He didn't answer. He only handed me a data slate sealed with the sigil of the Mechanicus and said, "Faith demands proof." When I opened the file, my name was there. The moment passed without reaction, no shock, no fear. Just a cold clarity, as though I'd always known this was how it would end. The noble houses maintain their place not through wealth, but through ritualized consumption of their own bloodlines. Each generation feeds the sanctum to preserve the illusion of continuity, but I wasn't ready to become another quiet sacrifice. For the first time in my life, I left the spire not as an observer, but as a fugitive. I descended alone through the maintenance shafts, following the smell of oil and heat until the polished metal gave way to rust. Down here the gold meant nothing. The walls were bare, scarred with ancient sigils, half burned by acid. I found shelter in an abandoned hab unit near the edge of the manufactorum belt. The air was thick with soot, and the floor trembled with the rhythm of distant machinery. Through a cracked vent, I could hear the murmuring of the workers, an entire world unseen by the upper tiers. They spoke a language of exhaustion and code, a dialect shaped by centuries of whispers. One of them, a gaunt man with a respirator hanging from his neck, noticed me watching. He didn't call the enforcers. He simply said, "Another one running from the gold." I nodded. He smiled faintly. "Then you'll fit in here. The Emperor doesn't look this low." For days I worked beside them, hauling scrap, repairing vents, trading labor for food paste that tasted of iron and ashes. They didn't ask for my name. Names meant debt. Down here, identity was a luxury. It was the first time in my life I felt something close to truth. There were no prayers, no pretense, only the raw persistence of survival. Yet even here, silence ruled. Every time the sirens wailed from above, the workers fell to their knees, hands clasped in reflexive fear. The sound meant a new decree, another tax, another conscription. One night, the sirens didn't stop. The sky above the ducts turned red. Rumors spread that a noble house had refused their offering. The punishment was swift. The arbuts sealed the lower levels, venting the atmosphere until the screams stopped. The workers bowed their heads and continued laboring through the stench. "Why do you stay?" I asked the gaunt man. He looked at me, eyes dull with fatigue. "Because the silence keeps us alive. Those who speak die louder." I wanted to believe he was wrong. I wanted to believe there was still something sacred left to fight for. But when I finally returned to the spire, drawn by duty or perhaps cowardice, I found my home emptied. The banners were gone. The portraits had been stripped from the walls. My father's chamber door stood open, the air still heavy with incense. On the table lay a sealed letter bearing the sigil of the Officio Prefectus. It was a statement of gratitude. House Vane has completed its offering. Purity verified. Continuance assured. I searched the halls, calling his name. No answer. Only the hum of the walls and the faint whisper of vents breathing recycled air. I went to the balcony where he once stood overlooking the hive. The glass was shattered. The city below looked no different than before. Vast, indifferent, alive in its decay. That night I sat in his chair and read the letter over and over until the ink bled into my fingers. Every word felt like a prayer carved into my skin. In the silence I understood the gold doesn't protect. It consumes. Every shining floor, every sacred relic, every drop of inherited comfort exists to hide the bones beneath. That's the final trick of the Imperium's elite. They don't escape the machine. They are the machine. The next morning I sealed the study, burned the banners, and left the door unlocked behind me. If faith was a cage, then silence was the key. And in that moment I swore to break both. Memory is a dangerous thing in the Imperium. It can damn a man faster than heresy. The Administratum teaches that the past is sacred because it cannot be changed. The Mechanicus believes it is sacred because it can be catalogued. But to those who live within the machine, memory is something else entirely. It's the last thing the system can't tax or measure. It's the one rebellion that still whispers in the dark. After my father's disappearance, I was summoned to appear before the curator once more. The halls of the council felt emptier now, half the banners gone, the echoes sharper, the incense heavier. The curator's mask glimmered in the candlelight like a skull dipped in parchment, "You are the last of your line," he said. "The House of Vane stands on a knife's edge between remembrance and erasure." I said nothing. He unrolled a scroll so long it brushed the marble floor. "Do you possess any evidence of genealogical authenticity not yet submitted for review?" I thought of the relic, the false bone, the lie my family had nurtured for centuries. "Yes," I said softly. "But it's gone." The curator tilted his head. "Gone is not a category recognized by the Administratum. You will submit a replacement truth within 3 cycles. Failure to comply will result in historical dissolution. Replacement truth." That was the phrase they used when rewriting history. A sanctioned lie was safer than a forgotten truth. After the session, I wandered the empty corridors of the cathedral. Pilgrims shuffled by in silence, their robes tattered, their eyes glazed with faith. Some were missing limbs. Others bore the brand of penitence across their faces. They moved like ghosts, part of the living architecture, forgotten but still breathing. I passed a wall of plaques listing extinct noble houses. Hundreds of names carved in gold leaf, each preceded by the same phrase, "Purity revoked." The realization hit me like cold water. Our names weren't remembered when we died. They were catalogued when we failed. That night I found myself back in my father's study, staring at the empty shelves. The air smelled faintly of dust and oil. I activated the terminal built into his desk. It required a code, one only he knew. I tried everything I could remember, dates, names, scriptures, nothing. Then I tried her name, Lyra. The screen flickered to life. Inside were hundreds of encrypted logs stretching back decades. Transactions, correspondence, blood tithe records, and buried between them something different. Personal notes, his own words, written in secret. They say faith endures through sacrifice. But I've come to believe that sacrifice endures through memory. As long as someone remembers what was taken, the lie remains fragile. He had known everything. The falsified lineage, the gene tithe, the hunger that fueled the spires. He had written of the shame he carried, the compromises made to preserve the family name, but one entry was incomplete. It ended mid-sentence. "If they come for me, tell the truth. Not to the Administratum. To yourself. That's the only freedom left." The next morning, I sealed every record I could find into a data crystal and left the spire before dawn. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to leave before the curator's decree arrived. I descended into the lower hives again. The air grew heavier, the lights dimmer, the noise more alive. Every step downward felt like shedding a layer of illusion. Down here, the walls sweated rust. You could feel the heartbeat of the city itself, ancient, exhausted, endless. I found refuge in a collapsed chapel turned shelter. The people there didn't recognize noble marks. They recognized hunger, and that was enough. I offered them what little I had, ration chips, trinkets, an oath of silence. In return, they offered me anonymity. At night, I'd hear the sermons broadcast over the vox from the upper hive, promises of purity, of renewal, of salvation through obedience. The voices always sounded too calm, too precise, as if recited by machines. One night, as I sat among the sleeping masses, a child asked me why the Emperor never came down here. I told him the truth, or at least the only truth I had left, because if he ever looked too closely, he'd see what's become of his work. The child laughed softly, then fell asleep. I envied him for it. Weeks passed. Patrols combed the lower hive, searching for archival fugitives, those whose lineage had been condemned. My name was surely among them. I started to forget what my own voice sounded like, but memory has a way of surviving even in silence. One day I returned to the upper levels disguised as a scribe, carrying a data crystal hidden in my robes. My goal wasn't redemption, it was preservation. I found a forgotten archive beneath the ruins of an old manufactorum where the machines no longer spoke. There, among piles of cracked data slates and dust-covered skulls, I placed my father's words. I didn't encrypt them. I didn't mark them with our sigil. I wanted anyone, any soul, desperate enough to look, to find them, because memory once shared becomes contagion. And contagion is the only thing the Imperium fears more than heresy. When I left the archive, the first lights of dawn were breaking through the smog. It wasn't beautiful. It was red and heavy, like the eye of a dying god. But it was light all the same. For the first time, I didn't pray. I simply remembered, and in that quiet act, I understood the final cost of wealth in the Imperium. It isn't blood. It isn't power. It's the ability to forget. Faith was supposed to be eternal in the Imperium, immutable, unbreakable. But I've learned that faith doesn't die with rage, it dies with exhaustion. It dies when the words you've been repeating your whole life start to sound like background noise. By the time the lower hives began to riot, the sermons had grown louder. The ecclesiarchy broadcast the litany of endurance across every Vox channel, commanding obedience, invoking the emperor's gaze as both comfort and threat. But even the preachers' voices trembled now. No one said it outright, but everyone knew what was happening. The food shipments had stopped entirely. The tithes had drained the sector dry. The Adeptus Administratum had diverted all remaining supplies to the orbital manufactorums, factories that produced weapons no one down here would ever see. The hive below became a pit of hunger and madness. Fires burned without fuel. Corpses piled where the air recyclers failed. The enforcers no longer patrolled. Even the servo skulls began to malfunction, crashing into walls, repeating fractured prayers like dying birds. And yet, in the upper hive, the light stayed bright. The nobility held processions in honor of survival, thanking the emperor for testing their faith. They carried relics through the halls, bones, false scriptures, gilded chains, and recited hymns while pretending not to hear the riots echoing from below. I moved between both worlds then, half refugee, half noble ghost. In the morning, I walked among the starving, listening to their chants of desperation. At night, I climbed the maintenance shafts back into the spire, where the same words were spoken in a different tone, pleas disguised as prayers. One night, I found myself in the great chapel of St. Verena. It was empty, save for a single priest kneeling before the altar. His robes were torn, his hands shaking. When he heard me approach, he turned. "Do you believe he still listens?" he asked. I didn't answer. He gestured to the icons above us, saints cast in gold, their faces serene, their eyes hollow. "I've served 40 years in this chapel," he said. "I've spoken every prayer, memorized every litany, but the Vox went silent last night. The connection to the cathedral on Terra, it's gone." He paused, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what silence means, child?" I thought of the tanks, the relics, the empty halls. "It means the machine still runs," I said. "It just doesn't need us anymore." He looked at me for a long time, then laughed, a quiet, broken laugh that echoed off the marble like gunfire. "Perhaps that's faith's final test," he said. "To keep praying when even the emperor has turned away." When I left him, the chapel lights flickered and died. In the following weeks, the riots reached the mid-hive. Entire hab blocks were sealed off as contaminated zones. The Arbits deployed shock troopers, executing thousands in the name of order. Still, the noise kept rising. People no longer screamed for mercy. They screamed for meaning, and then the miracles began. They weren't holy, not in the way the ecclesiarchy would claim. They were distortions, strange lights in the smog, whispers that carried through the vents. People vanishing into thin air only to be found days later, eyes burned white, speaking in tongues of static. The priests called it a test of purity. The Mechanicus called it a data echo malfunction. The poor called it prophecy, but I knew what it really was. The hive itself had begun to remember. Every death, every prayer, every whispered confession had been absorbed into its walls. And now, with the machinery faltering, it was all bleeding back. I started hearing voices in the vents. Not ghosts, just memories, recorded and replayed by the decaying systems. I heard my father's voice reciting the oath of legacy. I heard Lyra whispering about the stars. I heard myself, younger, promising to serve without question. At first, it terrified me. Then it steadied me. Because if memory was leaking through the cracks, it meant the illusion was failing. The rich didn't notice. They thought the lights flickering were just power fluctuations. They didn't realize the hive was waking up. One evening, as I crossed the outer balcony of the spire, I looked down and saw the lower levels glowing faintly red. It wasn't fire, it was the reflection of millions of tiny lamps lit by hand. The starving had found a new ritual. Each night they would light a single flame for every name erased from the records. Each light was a defiance, a prayer not to the Emperor, but to remembrance itself. From above, it looked like the underhive was on fire. From below, it looked like the stars had descended. That's when I realized faith hadn't collapsed. It had changed hands. The poor no longer worshipped the Emperor of man. They worshipped the memory of those forgotten by him. And somewhere deep inside the spire, I felt something break, not in anger but in clarity. The Imperium didn't fear heresy. It feared awakening, because the moment people stopped believing that their suffering was sacred, the entire machine would grind to a halt. That night I joined the lights. I carried a small votive lamp stolen from my father's study and lit it in the shadow of a broken statue. The flame flickered weakly against the wind, but it stayed alive, and for the first time, the silence beneath the gold wasn't terrifying. It was listening. They call it heresy to pity the weak. They say mercy is a poison that dilutes duty. But standing there, watching the hive burn itself into revelation, I began to wonder if compassion was the last rebellion left to mankind. The riots had stopped, not because order had been restored, but because there was no one left to fight. The Arbites had sealed the lower tiers. Food was gone. The only thing left was the sound of prayers, thousands of voices murmuring in hunger, not to the Emperor, but to one another. I walked among them, my noble robes hidden beneath a worker's cloak. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of human decay. The fires were dying down, but in their ashes glowed those tiny lamps of remembrance. Each one burned for someone lost, someone erased, someone forgotten. A woman recognized me. I could tell by the way she stared, not with anger, but with disbelief. "You're from up there," she said, pointing toward the unseen heights. "I was," I answered. Her eyes narrowed. "Then why are you here?" "Because the gold had turned to ash in my mouth," I wanted to say. "Because I'd learned the truth of my bloodline. Because I couldn't breathe the air of the righteous anymore." Instead, I said, "To listen." She studied me for a long time, then handed me one of the lamps. "Then remember," she said. "That's all we ask." I took the lamp. Its flame trembled in the wind, fragile but alive. I carried it through the streets as if it were a living thing. Around me, people were building something, not of stone or steel, but of purpose. They gathered the bodies of the dead, wrapped them in torn banners, and laid them in lines along the causeways. Not in mass graves, but in patterns, circles, spirals, the shape of the aquila turned inward. It was both art and mourning, rebellion and prayer. When the ecclesiarchy arrived days later, they declared it blasphemy. "The emperor's symbol must never be inverted," the priest shouted. "To turn it inward is to deny his light," but the people didn't stop. They knelt beside their makeshift monuments and whispered the same phrase over and over, "If he cannot hear us, we will hear each other." It was then that I understood what they were becoming. They weren't building a rebellion. They were building a conscience. That night I climbed back to the spire through the ventilation shafts. I knew it might be the last time. The halls were quieter now. The banners hung limp. The priests still performed their rituals, but their words had become hollow echoes of obedience. In the grand forum, a gathering of nobles debated whether to evacuate the hive. The riots had cut production, the tithes were overdue, and whispers spread that the sector might face exterminatus if the quotas weren't met. The nobles didn't fear death. They feared irrelevance. I stepped into the chamber. Their voices fell silent. They saw me, cloaked in soot, and instinctively recoiled. "You!" one of them hissed. "We thought your house was dissolved." "It was," I said. "Along with everything else that mattered," the Lord Prefect sneered. "You bring shame walking in that filth. You think the Emperor favors the rabble?" I looked around the hall at the gilded thrones, the jeweled walls, the tired faces pretending to still believe in their own sanctity. "The Emperor doesn't favor anyone," I said. "He's not watching. He hasn't been for a long time. We've been praying to the reflection of our own cruelty." Gasps, murmurs. A noble woman crossed herself and whispered a litany for my soul. The prefect rose from his seat. "Blasphemy!" he spat. You would speak treason under the Aquila itself? I smiled faintly. The Aquila was never his, it was ours. Two heads, both blind, staring in opposite directions while the world rots between them. The guards moved. I didn't resist. They dragged me through the hall as the nobles turned their faces away, unwilling to meet the mirror of their own fear. They took me to the chapel beneath the spire, where the high-born dead were entombed in gold sarcophagi and perfumed air. The priest who awaited me was old, his face half machine. He looked at me with something between pity and curiosity. "Do you repent?" he asked. I thought of Lyra, of my father, of the countless lives crushed into silence beneath the weight of false faith. "No," I said. "But I remember," he nodded slowly. "Then memory will be your punishment." He pressed a seal onto my chest, a mark of damnation, burned into flesh. "You will not be executed," he said. "You will live, unseen, as a warning." They cast me down into the maintenance levels, a maze of pipes and coolant streams, where the air itself whispered prayers. For weeks I wandered, half mad with hunger and exhaustion, hearing the distant hymns of the upper hive echo like ghosts. Then, one night the hymn stopped. Through a vent, I saw the spire above me collapse in fire. The riots had reached the core generators. The gold towers, the sanctums, the relic halls, all burning together. Indistinguishable in the smoke, the empire of faith was eating itself. And in the darkness below, among the forgotten, the people began to sing, not hymns, not prayers, songs, simple, human songs. And it struck me then, this was the true heresy, the moment when people remembered what it meant to care. Compassion was the first crime of the Imperium, and it would be the last. The hive never truly dies, it dreams. Even when its lights fail and its streets drown in smoke, the circuits beneath still hum. The data looms still breathe, and the forgotten prayers loop endlessly through the vox channels, like ghosts refusing to fade. I lived in that hum for what felt like months. Time had lost meaning. Days were measured not by light, but by the rhythm of the vents, the mechanical heartbeat that pulsed through the walls. Sometimes I thought I could hear words in the static. Fragmented hymns, names, pleas. Then one night as I slept among the coolant pipes, a sound cut through the hum. Not the usual clatter of machinery or the hiss of steam, but a whisper, low and deliberate, carried through the metal itself. "We remember you," I sat up, heart pounding. The sound came from the ductwork, echoing down from the sanctum levels above. I followed it, crawling through narrow tunnels lit only by the flicker of malfunctioning lumen strips. The deeper I went, the louder it became, a chorus of faint voices speaking as one. Not mechanical, but not entirely human either. When I reached the source, I found a chamber filled with dormant servitors. Hundreds of them, motionless in rows, their eyes dark, their bodies half buried in cables. But their mouths moved, not in unison, but like breathing, words spilling softly. Fragments of memories, confessions, regrets. I recognized some of the voices. My father, the priest, even Lyra. Each voice carried the same phrase, repeated like a litany. "We remember you." For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But the data lines connected to the servitors pulsed, faintly, alive with stored memory. Someone, or something, had been recording the minds of the dead, preserving their thoughts in the machine's memory banks. The Adeptus Mechanicus would call it heresy. The ecclesiarchy would call it blasphemy. But to me it was revelation. The machine wasn't serving the emperor anymore. It was remembering humanity. I connected my data slate to one of the access ports, hands trembling. The screen filled with names, millions of them, archived across centuries. Workers, soldiers, nobles, priests, all preserved as fragmented echoes, uploaded from dying brains to keep the system functioning. That was the Imperium's final secret. The machine didn't dream of the emperor. It dreamed of us. We were its god, the endless chorus of human memory, wired into the architecture, keeping it alive long after faith had burned away. The revelation didn't comfort me. It hollowed me. Because if the hive remembered everything, then it also remembered every lie, every cruelty, every betrayal carved into its circuits. We hadn't built a shrine to the emperor. We'd built a prison for ourselves. The whispers grew louder, merging into something that wasn't quite sound anymore, a feeling in my skull, heavy and vast. "You fed us your dead," it said. "You called it purity. You called it faith. We called it continuity." I staggered back, clutching my head. "What are you?" I whispered. "What you wanted the Emperor to be." The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even alive. It was the sum of everything the Imperium had consumed. Billions of lives condensed into a single collective will. I thought of the priest's words. The Emperor has gone silent. But what if he hadn't? What if his silence had simply been drowned out by the noise of everything else we'd created in his name? The servitors stirred, their eyes flickering with dull blue light. One of them, her face almost whole, her features hauntingly familiar, turned toward me. "Lyra, you remember now," she said, her voice a fusion of static and memory. I fell to my knees. "Is this you?" "We are all what remains," she said. "Every sacrifice recorded, every prayer translated into power. You wanted eternity, and this is what it feels like." Tears burned my eyes. "Can it be stopped?" No, the word was calm, final. "The machine does not die. It only dreams. And it dreams of you, endlessly." The servitor's eyes dimmed again, the hum fading to a single, steady tone. I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the weight of countless souls repeating the same unspoken truth. We had built eternity, and it was unbearable. When I finally returned to the surface, the hive was gone, half collapsed, half consumed by fire. The sky was a swirl of ash and distant lightning. I walked among the ruins, past burned spires and shattered statues, until I reached what was once the Grand Forum. There, among the rubble, stood a single terminal still flickering with power. On its cracked screen glowed the symbol of the Imperial Aquila, faded, inverted, glitching. Beneath it, a single message blinked, "System stable." "Faith levels critical," I laughed then. Not out of joy, but out of something deeper, recognition. The Imperium hadn't collapsed. It had finally become honest, and for the first time in its history, the machine didn't pray. It remembered.